Welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, a show that looks at issues in Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, the world, speaking of the world, across the globe, all the way to sunny Saanich. In his lair is John Jurisic, the Croatian sensation. How you doing, John?
Hey, I'm fantastic. We've had a couple weeks off, one of which I spent in the Okanagan, up in Vernon. Man, what was sort of anticipated to be a holiday turned out in fact to be an experience.
Do tell.
Like there are so first of all, the whole of the interior is burning up, and living here in Vancouver Island, we don't entirely understand the full essence of what that is. This entire region of our province burning up with the forest fires. That's kind of scary. So you're wondering what road to take, how to get in, where to go. Then you have the smoke, which is like, when you're editing a video or a photo and you come across the Wild West, version, and it all goes sort of orange and brownish, and that's what it's like living. It's like you're stuck, with this not even touching upon the health concerns of all this smoke that you're living in. So that's weird. On top of that, COVID is exploding in the Okanagan.
Yes.
We came out, the four of us. We're wearing a mask. We're sort of getting our hands down all the time. Nobody's wearing masks. Old, young, middle. It's like nothing's going on. Yet COVID is. You feel like it's all around you. It's all consuming. I know it isn't, but it's kind of a weird feeling. So you're in this smoky thing, then you've got these COVID concerns. Anyway, we'd had great wine tours, drank lots of wine. So none of that stopped us from doing that.
Finally, right? You had delays because of the fires, didn't you?
Well, yeah. So then we come back, and BC Ferries and our province had the busiest time ever. Like there were 9 sailing waits. We had to stay overnight in Vancouver to catch a ferry. So it was a great experience. Not sure it fell into the holiday category, but I feel relieved. I feel refreshed. I feel like a lot of clutter has left my mind. So I'm so happy to get back into the Victoria Rumble Room saddle.
There have been people kind of despondent from your absence because we have our regular men's lunch at the end of every month. And Chris Coleman, the former Victoria councillor, who is a friend of this show, showed up to honor the Rumble Room and honor John Jurisic. He wore his Croatian shirt. And where was John Jurisic? And what a sad experience that was to see Chris Coleman all dressed up in his finery.
We're showing the picture as we're talking, and I'm telling you, he looks great. He could easily qualify for one of a number of Croatian sports teams. Of course, including my favorite, water polo. That would be a great shirt. Might sink him once it gets wet. But Chris, thank you. I was detained in fires and ferries and COVID. I'll be at the next networking group. Who knows what I'll be wearing? Maybe my Speedo.
Well, I'm sure that'll draw a lot of attention.
Well, it would. We'd certainly have a lot of room to sit, wouldn't we?
We're glad you made it back, John, and we feel very lucky to be on Vancouver Island, of course. Looks like it's going to get some rain finally. We've had some smoke. It's been drifting up from Seattle and Washington State, but we haven't had a terrible time with it on Vancouver Island. Cross our fingers that we get through that. But we do have a terrible time still in this province and in Canada with COVID-19. We're not out of the woods yet, and I have a few thoughts on that. First, congratulations, Canada. We are leading the world per capita in getting our vaccinations. Over 64% fully vaccinated in this country. Over 70% have had at least one shot. Canadians are really rising to the challenge. It's fantastic. But the Delta variant is rapidly spreading, and it's way more contagious than COVID-19. And it's hitting our anti-vaxxers in Canada. It's hitting our young people. It's going quickly through places like the Okanagan, like Alberta, other pockets across the country. And we don't want a fourth wave of this pandemic to really take hold. Who wants to go back to that? Having to wear masks everywhere, having to stop going out and seeing your friends, all of the things that came with the pandemic in that first wave could be back with us with the fourth. Let's put a stop to it. Now, we don't have 100 million people like they do in the United States refusing to get vaccinated. That's a bigger problem, I think. But we still have our anti-vaxxers who still believe that maybe it's a government conspiracy, or maybe the pandemic's not as serious as it's being portrayed by politicians or by the media. I think that's just nuts. Let's not turn back the clock. Let's move forward so we don't have to do what they're doing in France, where we have Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, issuing this statement saying, I no longer have the intention of sacrificing my life, my time, or my freedom for those who refuse to get vaccinated. This time, it's you who stays home, not us. In France, those who don't get vaccinated are not going to be admitted to restaurants, cafes, museums. They can't go on trains. They can't fly. And it's a terrible situation. We don't want to replicate that in Canada. I think we can avoid it. Let's move forward. Encourage your friends, encourage family members, anybody you know who hasn't been vaccinated. Let's do it, and let's move forward to a better future.
Wow, Robin, fantastic way to capture the feelings of all of us. And I kind of went through that with this recent trip. These folks are not wearing masks. It feels like they're not concerned, yet the COVID is spiking. Wear your masks. Come on, the simplest of methods to stop this pandemic. Now, we came out of some of the most beautiful sites in BC, in the world. Oh my God. So come on, let's go. Let's get rid of this thing. Please do the basic fundamentals to get rid of this disease. Now,
and still see the sites at the same time, right, John?
Yeah, we went through. BC has so many. Okanagan has so many. Victoria has so many that I haven't even seen. We're in a few minutes going to be talking about attraction that many folks probably are going to say, really? I don't think I've seen that. Kelly Black from the Point Ellice Historic House and Museum will be joining us. And I can honestly say, Robin, I have got to go there. What a place.
You know, it's really interesting. It's one of those hidden treasures, John.
Right.
And you drive over the Bay Street Bridge, over the Gorge Causeway, or the waterway on the gorge, and you hardly notice this attraction. After you cross the bridge, you turn past the cement trucks, and you come to this gate, and you come into this beautiful, unexpected world. It's the third oldest house in Victoria, built by the Hudson's Bay Company, and once the home of the man who set up every First Nations reserve in British Columbia, 600 of them.
Right.
And we will hear all about that in a few minutes' time. But first, John, we're going to talk about the rapid growth in Victoria. It just seems to keep growing and growing.
Affordable workforce housing is an issue I have a lot of experience with. I've done a lot of advocacy with. I have a lot of understanding of how density and lack of housing for our young people is impacting the growth of our region. It looks like the spike in housing prices is finally leveling off, maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe for a month during the summer. New construction is happening everywhere. I mean, you drive through the West Shore, it's like really the whole place is under construction. When will that ever end? And the all of South Island is really rapidly changing before our eyes. So you and I thought, let's get someone to talk about that. Let's get some expertise. Dr. Ted Relph is our speaker. He taught geography and planning at the University of Toronto for many years, has written several books on the subject. He's now retired, living in the best place on the planet, West Coast, and warns that our local urban planning, expected to be good for the next 30 years, isn't really working. Wow, isn't that fascinating? Can't wait to hear him talk about that and provide my input. Our region is growing twice as fast as projected, twice as fast. So what are we going to do? Are we going to be, is the Lower Vancouver Island going to be this perpetual construction zone? Maybe. By 2038, the capital region will be at 475,000 residents. Hey, 475,000. So let's zoom in. Ted Relph.
And Ted Relph now joins us in the Victoria Rumble Room. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So in your recent editorial, which has got a fair amount of attention in Greater Victoria, in the Times Colonist, you suggested that people in the capital region are at risk of losing their sense of place, essentially. And we have this distinct character here on the South Island. We got all the beautiful old character homes. And it seems that because of rapid urban development and, we have a lot of density coming to play. Is it a catch-22, do you think, that we've become so attractive that it's encouraging too many people to come too quickly to the South Island, and it's changing the whole character of the place?
Well, first thing I should mention is that sense of place has always been changing in Victoria as everywhere else. So it's it's constantly changing, but it's changing around something which provides continuity. And I think what's special about Victoria, apart from the mild climate and the local and the environment, we're very close to natural spaces here. In addition to that, Victoria is one of the oldest cities not only in Western Canada, but on the West Coast. And it's really not like any cities or small cities or big cities until you get back to Ontario. And the reason for that is because it was settled before the age of automobiles. It was laid out, the grid pattern was laid out, some of it initially by the Hudson Bay Company, and some of the roads, which sort of wind around a lot, which is unusual in Canada. They were the access roads to all the supply farms for the Hudson Bay Company. So we have a really distinctive element with that. It was complemented by the fact that Victoria was a streetcar city. It built up around the streetcars around the beginning of the 20th century, end of 19th century. One of the first cities in Canada to get electric streetcars. And those increased the density because people were walking to the streetcars and then taking the streetcars to downtown. They created a lot of the little neighborhood centers, which I don't know in any other city in Canada. The places, well, I live close to Cook Street Village, but Fernwood is another case. The examples in Vic West, Estevan in Oak Bay, and so on. So there are lots of those. Those are a distinctive feature of the sense of place, the character of Victoria. What I think is happening is that the pace of growth is accelerating so rapidly that those could easily be overtaken just by the speed of development. And I want to add two things, which I didn't write about in that editorial, but I've been thinking about this in the last couple of weeks. One was really obvious last week, and that's the rate of climate change and climate warming, which is coming way faster than it was expected. And the other is the chronic problem of affordability, which is intensifying much faster than anybody expected. So you have those three things of growth, climate change, and affordability all coming together very suddenly. And that the cumulative long-term consequences of that are going to prove really challenging to that old identity of Victoria, which was really and much of the region, incidentally, which was really established almost 100 years ago and has been modified and built around. But it's at the core of the sense of place of Victoria.
Ted, I've been so looking forward to this interview. Both professionally and personally, I have been involved in this issue of affordable workforce housing for about a decade. And I've been an advocate for more affordable workforce housing, especially on the peninsula, the 3 municipalities out there, in which is close to 100 or 110 manufacturing companies once you start to look, but be sort of, underneath the table, the facts are that the economic engine of the Lower Vancouver Island is actually on the peninsula, which has sort of the least affordable and the least amount of housing for folks that are either living or working out there. Of the close to 5,000 employees that are within the airport, the ferries, the municipalities, and the industrial companies, okay, almost 25% of them leave those three municipalities and drive their car to go home somewhere else. Of that percentage that are leaving, half go to the West Shore. So there's this sort of L-shaped thing going on, completely bypassing Victoria. So the West Shore is exploding, and you end up having those mayors going, okay, we're exploding out here. And this sort of, okay. So then eventually you start to lobby, as I did, the mayors and the councils. They have no interest in growth. They have no interest in really dealing with these issues. And so the solution to a lot of our workforce housing issues around Lower Vancouver Island becomes more efficient transportation. How do you move people around this region more effectively? Now, you have mentioned that our projected population is going up to potentially 500,000 by the late 2020s, 50,000 more than expected. That means almost 35,000 more vehicles on the road. I, as yourself, do not see the CRD reacting to this as this sort of regional challenge. Yet the CRD is responding to your comments, saying that they're organized. What do you think of all this? What's your response to my comments, the CRD's comments?
Well, the CRD is reacting in some way. In fact, that editorial by the director of planning, I think, in the CRD, led me to investigate their website. And what he mentioned some of this. So he said my data were out of date.
Right.
Well, not really, but what they had done, what I didn't know, because in I think it was in April, the CRD actually did approve an increase in the projected numbers for 2038, and which is a bit lower than mine. Not, I think, significantly lower. So they are going to suggest a growth of about 40,000 rather than 50,000. So we have 1.5 vehicles per household in the CRD. You can work that out quickly for yourself. But it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 30,000 more vehicles. So they are looking at that. They are also doing, I'm going to defend the CRD here straight. They are also have had studies on origin and destination journeys. So it was done in 2017. They're tracking the journeys between the West Shore and the peninsula and into Victoria and out of Victoria. And so that was studied quite closely. So they do have some sense of that. That's one thing. Second thing is that under the regional growth strategy of the CRD, those peninsula municipalities, North Saanich and Sydney and Central Saanich, are really identified as very low growth areas. Central Saanich and North Saanich, because they have a lot of agricultural land.
Yes.
And that has to be protected. So partly ALR, but also because the regional growth strategy is limiting growth to existing urban areas, which would include Saanich, for instance, Brentwood Bay. Sydney, I was in Sydney on Saturday morning, and it was really humming. And there's a lot of new development going on in Sydney. There
is, and a real schism within that community, a real schism over old Sydney, new Sydney, across the street, Beacon Avenue, Sydney.
Well, that's interesting to know. I wasn't aware. You're reading the local news, and you have contacts, and I hadn't heard about that schism. My sense, looking at it, sort of as an outsider, is that Sydney is actually doing a pretty good job accommodating increased growth. Of
the three municipalities, yes, I agree with you. Yeah.
The others are restricted by the CRD. Their projections for population growth for Central Saanich and North Saanich are very modest, as they are incidentally for Oak Bay, which is, the projection shows a slight decline. We can pursue that, but
we don't want to be too morbid yet.
But I think the comment about the fact that there's so much employment in those municipalities in the peninsula, and that there's a lot of commuting from Victoria to those, so that's driving the traffic on the Pat Bay Highway and through the along Mackenzie and over the new interchange.
Yeah.
So that's an issue, that the employment is not necessarily where the people are. Whether transportation can resolve that is question. There is something which is just recent. It was in the Times Colonist the other day about the BC Transit is introducing a rapid bus service.
Right.
Initially out to the West Shore, but also in due course up the peninsula on the Pat Bay Highway. Now, to your point, John, are they doing enough? I would think not. I think my concern about growth is that it's happening so much faster than anybody really anticipated, that it needs to be responded to a lot faster. So we need a rapid bus system, which is more like this. Actually, there's one you were talking about, Markham and some of the communities around Toronto. They have implemented rapid bus transit with the dedicated stops, in some cases fully dedicated laneways, and they then feed into the subway system in Toronto. We need something more along those lines. But at the moment, we've got the CRD sort of talking about the problems and limiting growth, and you've got BC Transit, which is coordinating with CRD, but it's a different institution. And you've got the municipalities all sort of working away. I think they're coordinating, they know what's going on, but they're working away almost in their own worlds.
It's the gift of 13 municipalities for 350,000 people. It's a gift that keeps on giving, Ted.
Well, I know, I was reading something about Canada's adaptation to climate in the last few days. And someone writing about that said, well, we're trying to develop a national adaptation strategy. And they commented that it's like having a single vehicle with 13 steering wheels. Well, I think the capital region is kind of a microcosm of that. All the municipalities are pulling in slightly different directions. And so things like the sewage treatment plant don't, or in fact, the regional growth study don't get approved for years. But it's a dysfunction by the sea.
It's an ongoing challenge for sure. I would love to dig into it. Just a couple of issues that have come up in the last month that I'm sure you have nothing but things to say about. And one of them, of course, was highlighted around with your commentary, and that would be the Harris Green Village, which is going to bring in 2,000 people living in 1,500 apartments. And does it fit with the city? Is it the new Victoria? Is it appropriate? I mean, we have nowhere to build but up. Victoria is basically at the end of the island. There's nowhere else there's no other room. There's not miles of farmland like places like Toronto where you can just spread out for miles and miles. If you don't go up, you don't go anywhere.
Well, it could be the model for the future, which is why I think it's a problematic development. It's the scale of it is quite. I'm going back to my comments about the sense of place in Victoria, which is really, particularly in the downtown core, we have small blocks, usually with several different developments on each block. And this is suddenly 1.5 blocks, essentially one development. It's going to have a 6-story high podium running along both Yates Street and View Street on 2 sides, 6 stories high. That in itself would be remarkable. And then all these towers reaching up to about 30 stories. That's a sort of development. First thing is, it's a sort of development that would be appropriate probably in parts of Toronto or in Vancouver. it doesn't seem to be appropriate here. It's not consistent with the official community plan, which actually has, there's a map in one of the downtown core area plan it is, but there's a map which clearly says with block capitals, maximum building height 20 stories. How do they get to 30 stories? There's no explanation of that in the development application. I don't know, but I think it's an attempt to really push the boundaries and to establish a new type of development for the city.
Wow. Oh, come on. That was great to hear Dr. Ted Relph's take on the growth of Greater Victoria, to hear some of the sort of factual academic side of what we think is an explosion in construction. And of course, it's part of a mission critical theme. This region is going to grow. Last week, we heard from Mike Kazakowski of Citified Victoria. This could be the preeminent issue for our region. And we're going to talk more about it in the coming months and try to understand what is going on with all this construction and all these people arriving here.
You know, you see it at so many different angles. I was just driving out to French Beach on the weekend with my family and out towards and beyond Souk. It was bumper to bumper, both ways, bumper to bumper. Tons of construction on the road as well, but so much development in that part of the Lower Island. And that's just one area where things are really, really taking off. And it's just amazing how much growth is taking place. And, you know, we have all these interesting anomalies that come from rapid growth, even closer to home, where rapid growth kind of took over some pastoral areas near the gorge where this beautiful old house stood. And eventually that pastoral area all became an industrial area, Victoria, except for this small enclave that retains a bit of the past. And we're talking about the Point Ellice Historic House and Museum. It's only open right now on Saturdays and Sundays. It only has $80,000 a year as a budget. It's not being necessarily put at the top of the list in terms of funding. And in the past, people have gone there to see the old house, to see the artifacts, the nice tranquil setting. They need another reason for people to come out. And I think they've really hit on one, John, because they're talking now about the fact that they want to tie in with Native reconciliation, the fact that the longtime resident of that particular house was also the gentleman who designed 600 reserves across British Columbia. And this was all done as part of our deal with Confederation when British Columbia entered Canada. And this was done in the name of the Indian Act. And we're still living with those decisions today, all this time and later. It's still part of the issues that we're dealing with today, right down to residential schools. And to talk about this now is the executive director of Point Ellice House. He's also a university professor, a historian, Dr. Kelly Black. Let's zoom him in. And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room is Dr. Kelly Black from Point Ellice House, Museum and Garden. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me on the show.
And Kelly, I know that you have a PhD in Canadian studies, a great interest in the whole issue of Native reconciliation in this province. There are some are describing it, the settler-indigenous relations. You actually poked your nose into things. I've read in the paper, you've talking out on things like renaming and rebranding and the legitimacy of statues and things of that nature. And it all comes in the middle of this much larger debate across the country about reconciliation. Of course, the very sad story of what's happened in our residential schools and what that pertains to, but also the First Nations leadership here on the South Island speaking out in unanimity, saying that they don't appreciate that things are being done, at least ostensibly, in their name, like the burning of churches or defacement of monuments. So where do you land in all of this in the middle of this controversy?
Wow. Well, that's a tough one, but a good and important and timely question. I mean, first of all, I think as a non-Indigenous person, I can't speak on behalf of what Leadership Council and others are saying or how they're feeling, but I know from my perspective, just generally, that these are conversations that are long overdue,
Right.
on Vancouver Island, in British Columbia, in Canada. And I think the more that we're talking about the ongoing legacy of colonization in this country is a good thing. And as I'm sure you both know, we have a tendency to forget about things as soon as they drop out of the news cycle. The news of, for example, mass graves and Indigenous children being murdered or losing their lives at residential schools is something that has been known about for a very long time, particularly by Indigenous peoples in Canada, but even reported on by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. So this isn't new information. In terms of knowing that these things happen and that these people are buried there. And so having it be in the news and having us engage in these conversations, particularly as non-Indigenous peoples, is very, very important. And so from that perspective, I'm glad to be, hearing from survivors of residential schools and hearing about people engaging with the history of places like Victoria, Vancouver Island, etc. As you mentioned, I have studied settler Indigenous relations in Canada, British Columbia, and more specifically on southern Vancouver Island, where I was born and raised. And the more you learn about the history of Canada, or even the colonial history of British Columbia, Vancouver Island, the more I think it calls into question what we as non-Indigenous peoples have learned or thought we knew about these places.
Okay, but it doesn't merit burning down churches. You'd grant me that maybe things have gone way too far when you've got churches being burned, you have statues being knocked down, and then conversely, you have people setting fire to a totem pole on the Malahat. I mean, to me, that really takes away from what you're saying, which is we need to learn more about our history and we have to move forward as a people in trying to find a way out.
Yeah, I think, the question of burning churches is one, I'm not here to justify that in any way, but I think when you start, well, first of all, we don't know the context of every one of those examples, who was responsible and the reason that they did it. Of course, when we put it in the context of the news, we can infer, but there's still investigations ongoing. I guess what I will say is that when you have to start from a place of understanding, I think, that Canada committed genocide against Indigenous peoples. And when you put that in context, the question of the burning of churches in particular is an intensely complicated one. And what I mean by that is that Indigenous peoples themselves have a very complicated relationship with the church or churches in Canada. So you have, for example, elders in First Nations or Inuit Métis communities who are religious and grew up with that background. For example, because of residential schools and because of the presence of missionaries in their communities. And then you have a younger generation that looks at what happened to their elders, the abuse, the death, the cultural genocide and genocide, who are frustrated and fed up and aren't seeing the real kind of actions that they want.
But you're not suggesting that violent actions in the past now are justified violent actions today, are you?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that it isn't past, it's ongoing. For example, the federal government has been fighting the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School in Northern Ontario in court since 2014. This is a residential school where they used an electric chair on children. And the federal government has been denying the release of records pertaining to the abuse that happened at this residential school. This is today, the federal government under Carolyn Bennett and Justin Trudeau is in court saying we do not want to release the records related to what happened there. So when we start to understand that it isn't something that happened a long time ago, that the Canadian government at this very moment is defending or seeking to obscure what has happened, that for me, changes how people, Indigenous people in particular, are processing the legacy and the ongoing trauma of residential schools. And I'm not saying that to justify anybody's actions, but what I'm trying to say is to place it in the context of, if you came from a community where your loved ones were sent away, abused, maybe died, and there was no justice for them, how would you feel? You know, there's nobody from the Catholic Church, just to pick one of the churches, has ever gone to jail or suffered any kind of punishment for what happened in residential schools. So is that justice for the survivors? It's not for me to say, but I think what some people are trying to say is that we're tired of waiting for justice on these issues that won't come.
I think we can be reasonably confident that we can separate the issues. There is the Canadian reaction to the Indigenous historical context, and that there, Canadians of every kind have different interpretations of that.
Sure.
Then there is what's going on right now with these churches and vandalism and burning, of which the Lower Vancouver Island Leadership Council, consisting of the maybe dozen or so nations on here in Lower, and all last week agreed that is not acceptable. These are not acceptable ways in which to react to the Indigenous experience in Canada,
Sure.
which needs to be ongoing, and which Robin and I have been talking about on our show now better part of the summer.
Right.
I personally am not in favor of the reaction. I really want to support, however, what you just said, in that we don't know the context of who's doing this.
Yeah.
It's been pointed out pretty clear through police activity and reporting that Indigenous people were not involved with the taking down of the Captain Cook statue in the Inner Harbor. Who was? It turns out those could be activists for hire. So there's a whole bunch of stuff on that side that needs to be re-examined. And yet it does appear that the leadership here locally on Lower Vancouver Island is not in favor of this. However, I fully empathize with your viewpoints around, if my parents, now, in no way can I analogize exactly to the situation here in Canada, but I come from a place in which there has been fighting for hundreds of years, that being the Baltics.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the anger and around not liking somebody just because that, something happened 200 years ago. There's something in that I get that comes to today.
Right. Right.
So I have some, nonetheless, this is likely a little bit off point. We did want to talk to you about Point Ellice House.
Oh, that's
I think it was worth, putting some of this into a current context, not solving anything, but just trying to better understand it so we can move forward. Point Ellice House was built and first occupied by people linked to the Hudson's Bay Company. Man, oh man, is that a name within our historical context, right?
Yeah,
it's one of the oldest buildings standing in Victoria, but you're now publicizing a newer tenant, someone I understand who's responsible for the creation of reserves across British Columbia. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, of course. Well, so to your point about the Hudson's Bay Company, the house was built in 1861-62 for Kate and Charles Wallace. And Kate was the Métis daughter of John Work, who was a chief factor for the Hudson's Bay Company. And the Hudson's Bay Company employees, many of the higher ups, had very large estates, one of which for Work was the Hillside Estate. And he carved 2 acres out for one of his daughters who was newly married, and there they built Point Ellice House. They only lived at Point Ellice House for about 5 years before they encountered some financial troubles and they had to sell the house. in which after that, the O'Reilly family moved in 1867. And there, or here, I should say, they lived for 108 years until 1975. And as you mentioned, Peter O'Reilly, who arrived in the colony of Vancouver Island and then the colony of British Columbia in 1859 to work as a gold commissioner, he would later go on to become, in 1880, the Indian Reserve Commissioner for British Columbia. So just as some very quick context, we're speaking in July of 2021, and this is the 150th anniversary of British Columbia entering Confederation with Canada. Speaking of Canada.
Right.
And so when that happened, Canada, as I'm sure you know, is responsible for Indigenous affairs under the British North America Act, the Constitution. So Canada said to the new province of British Columbia, show us your reserves and show us your treaties. And to make a long story short, British Columbia said, oh, we don't have any of that. And we don't really want to do any of that. And so there's a lot of back and forth between British Columbia and Canada trying to figure out, well, how do we create a reserve system? How do we end, in their words, quote unquote, the Indian land question? Open up land for settlement, colony, and industry, etc. And so after some stops and starts in the 1870s, some people quit because they're not happy with the Indian Reserve Commission. And eventually, Joseph Trutch, Peter O'Reilly's brother-in-law, recommends Peter O'Reilly to John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister, to be the Indian Reserve Commissioner. And he does that job for 18 years. And he goes around the province setting out, reducing, eliminating, or creating reserves, over 600 reserves from every corner of the province, Vancouver Island to the north, to the south, etc. And that history is something that at Point Ellice House prior to 2019, when our not-for-profit society took over, was not talked about. It was essentially purposely left out of the key narratives. And so, as you mentioned, John, we are working to reinsert that narrative and talk about the role that people like Peter O'Reilly played in colonizing the province of British Columbia.
Now, I know that Trutch has been vilified, and now they're changing names on streets. And I know it's happened in Vancouver already, and they're talking about it in Victoria. The other gentleman who actually goes out and finds the reserves, we don't hear as much about him. He's historically not as well known, and I know you want to change that. Was he himself unsympathetic to the First Nations and to the Aboriginal people, or did he go out, do you think, in his own mind, to do good work to help them relocate and find a place to live, or is it something in between that?
It's a good question, Robin. I think, like all things historical, or when you're speaking with a historian, as you said, it's somewhere in between. It's important to remember that people like Peter O'Reilly or Joseph Trutch believed, like a lot of European or British or American or later Canadian people, believed that Indigenous peoples were, quote unquote, wasting the land. So if there wasn't a fence, if there wasn't a farm, if you didn't have cattle, that was a waste. So non-Indigenous peoples couldn't see how Indigenous peoples used the land for their own traditions and culture. Mm-hmm. And so when a person like Peter O'Reilly was instructed by his brother-in-law, Trutch, Macdonald, others, to go and essentially identify if they were wasting the land and then set out a reserve for them. In some case, we're talking about 600 reserves over 18 years. So there's lots of different examples. There's examples where Peter O'Reilly comes in and he says he sometimes would consult with leaders, and they would say, well, from here to here is what is important to us. And he would say, well, you're not cultivating that. So really you only need this much. So I'm just going to draw the square on the map over here onto the next one. In other cases, settlers, newly arrived settlers would claim water rights, for example. And he would write in defense of a reserve that he created and say, I purposely set out access to water for this nation, and this settler shouldn't be entitled to it. Of course, he did that because he and Canada generally wanted the Indigenous First Nations to become farmers, to assimilate them into Canadian culture. So, even when he was maybe acting somewhat benevolently in the context of the time, it's still, the end goal was still to assimilate or eliminate Indigenous culture in Canada. And so it is a mixed record, but that context is always surrounding.
But it was a prevalent attitude at the time. I mean, I know that you and I chatted before about this, and we don't have to go down this trail very far. You were saying there were more enlightened people back in the 1800s who were very unhappy about the way the Indigenous people were being treated, but it wasn't an unusual thing in the 1800s at that time to take a rather dim view at the civilization of our Indigenous people.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Trutch and O'Reilly, who are, brothers-in-law, is a great example, because we have very clearly in the historical record some very appalling statements from Joseph Trutch on how he viewed First Nations in the province. And while Peter O'Reilly has views that today we don't, generally agree with or recognize per se, he doesn't say things in the same way as Trutch does. So even Trutch is even a little bit more extreme in his views. Another example is Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, who is the Indian Reserve Commissioner prior to Peter O'Reilly. And while he is going around setting out reserves, he's trying to do so a bit more generously than the people before, the people he was working with, or Peter O'Reilly did afterwards. Still, because he thought, that they could become Canadians essentially, or British Columbians. But he resigns in protest because he says British Columbia is being incredibly unfair. So it is a mixed record, and people, the idea that they were products of their time may hold up when we talk about how they believe that Indigenous people would be assimilated or this kind of thing, but there's still a spectrum of those views, Trutch being on one end and a person like Gilbert Malcolm Sproat perhaps being on the other.
I'm fascinated. My degree from UVic is in history. I'm not a historian necessarily, but I was fascinated by history and always battled internally the way to interpret commentary or philosophies from another time, because there's a different context in which those comments are made, even in our lifetime, in my lifetime. Same-sex marriage and everything about LGBTQ 20, 30 years ago was within a completely different context. If one were to talk about that,
sure, it
was not within today's context and would likely be interpreted as very wrong and unfair. So I really, this is back to Robin's earlier sort of questioning around how is it possible that we can react today to things that happened hundreds years ago, decades ago. We have to reconcile that with the wisdom of people like you, Kelly, who can help us understand these different times.
Well, I think, Robin mentioned I had been quoted in the paper, one of the local papers, about the statue controversy. And one of the things I said was things like the statue of Captain Cook, and a lot of historians and other people are saying this, as well, but they actually tell us more about the values of the people who put up the statue rather than who Captain Cook was or what Captain Cook did. Because there was a time when people decided to get together and celebrate Captain Cook as a founder of British Columbia and go around putting up cairns at places like Yuquat in the 1920s, and then later putting up a statue in the inner harbor of Victoria. I mean, Captain Cook never set his eyes on Victoria. In fact, he missed the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He sailed right past it, didn't even know it was there. It was covered in fog.
And for that, he should be removed.
Well, and so I think, even now the statue coming down, whether you agree with it or not, as you're saying, John, it tells us something about our time and is also a moment in history that I'm sure 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, there'll be another podcast or whatever they call it then, where they'll be saying, you hear what those guys, Kelly and Robin and John, were talking about? Man, were they wrong back then?
Right.
And that's the nature of history, right?
Yeah.
It's not static.
Yeah.
No, and I think some of the things we're talking about, we're wrestling with ourselves internally and how we feel. And I mean, I'm a sixth generation Canadian and very proud of my country and very proud of my family. And I can say, while I feel huge sympathy for what's happened to the Indigenous people, I know for a fact this is not carried through my entire family history. It's not that my family was against Indigenous people, but it wasn't a big part of their world. I mean, their world was to build a country and get ahead, do things for their families, and that was a big push. My own parents were very big, however, on reconciliation and worked on that. So it does evolve even within families. And I don't want to go down this trail much further because I think we want to get back to Point Ellice House. And I that was the purpose of having you on in the first place. So we don't want to get down this trail too far. But I do really appreciate you bringing up these points because it's so important that people think about these issues. They don't have to agree with everything you're saying, but for us to actually have this discussion and people to think about it is the most important thing. So back to Point Ellice, if you don't mind.
No, not at all.
Now, it's not in the same picturesque, bucolic location as some of our other sites. Now we have, Craigdarroch Castle, which I've been closely aligned with for a number of years, up on this beautiful bluff in Rockland, and it's just a spectacular place to go and see. You've got out in central Saanich, Bouchard Gardens, and it sits out there with ocean views, and it's so lovely. Yeah. And then you've got, Point Ellice House and Museum and Garden at the end of the Bay Street Bridge, close to a lot of industrial area that people don't really know about. No. It's just, I guess, in some senses, bad luck because there was nothing wrong with that location when the house was built, and there's nothing wrong with it now, but you have a bit of work to do to get people to come down and check it out.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly right. So we're on Pleasant Street, which, as you mentioned, Robin, is just before you cross over the Point Ellice Bridge or the Bay Street Bridge. And, speaking of history, really where we are, it was when it was built in 1862, it was not even in the city of Victoria. It was well on the outskirts of Victoria. It was sort of a semi-urban or semi-rural estate. And of course, over time, though, things changed. One of the main things being in the 1930s in particular, a lot of the families who had houses in this area owed back taxes. And the properties were sold or given to the city, which then over time they were rezoned for industry. And when you extrapolate that over the decades, essentially Point Ellice House is the last remainder. All around us is light industry, metal recycling, waste transfer, gravel marts. So most, as you mentioned, a place like lots of people go walking in Rockland. Of course, it's lovely, beautiful, shady, big trees, gorgeous, streets and homes. You're not really going for a walk in our neighborhood. So we don't have a lot of people who happen to be walking by and go, oh, let's check this out. Right. And so the thing is, our thing is about trying to get people in the gates, because once you enter the gates from the street, it's an amazing 2-acre, as a lot of people like to call it, oasis. Heritage gardens, mature trees, 160-year-old home, beautiful gravel pathways lined with boulders and bricks. And it's a very special place. We have the longest remaining natural shoreline on the Gorge Waterway, so it's important to the environment as well. So it's doing that work of trying to get people in the gates that we're working very hard at right now.
The economic reality now of Point Ellice House and other places like Robin mentioned, Craigdarroch, what's your strategy around attracting people to Point Ellice? What would be some final words that we can clip and distribute amongst our social networks?
It's the most fascinating place you've never heard of. One of the main things we hear from visitors here, like yourselves, when they come here is, I've lived in Victoria my whole life. I've never been here, And part of the reason for that is because of the way this place was managed in the past was primarily directed at tourists. And what we've tried to say is actually Point Ellice House is a fascinating place to learn about local history. And if you're not learning about a person like Joseph Trutch from a street name, which you probably aren't, you can come to a place like Point Ellice House and genuinely learn about him. If it's something that you think people, we need to know about, then you can come to a place like Point Ellice House and we will tell you lots about Joseph Trutch and his legacy because of his connection to Point Ellice House. And I think that's really important to kind of bookend the whole conversation here, is that if we truly want to learn more about the legacy of colonization, we can learn about it at a place like Point Ellice House, and not in a shameful way or a you're wrong kind of a way, but in a way to say, people like this lived here, and this is the context for how they went about their lives. And I think that, on top of it just being a really beautiful place when you come here, filled with flowers and wildlife and interesting objects, we as a society need to work to engage with our history in a meaningful way. And I hope that as we've kind of looked more locally through the pandemic, I hope that sticks and that people are encouraged to get more engaged with their location. Victoria has Be a Tourist in Your own hometown, which has been going for a long, long time.
Yes.
And I feel like that mentality should carry throughout the years. And so what we're trying to do is present local stories to local people first and foremost, to say, here's something that you might identify with. We have an exhibit about the history of waste and water in the city right now. And one of the things we did was take landmarks that are all over the city that I guarantee you've seen or you've walked past, like the Rockland Water Tower, speaking of Craigdarroch Castle,
yes,
or Smiths Hill Reservoir at Summit Park. And to show people that you see these places all the time, but here's their historical context. They were built to provide drinking water to certain neighborhoods in the city of Victoria. And we're just hoping that people will see that and be prompted to think a little bit more about how things have come to be in a place like Victoria.
Robin, that was great hearing about Point Ellice House. Notwithstanding that I had no idea about this, such an important historical place in our region, man. And they only get 80 grand a year for funding. I mean, come on. Oh boy, needs to find its feet, become a bigger part of our cultural and tourism sector. Hopefully our show is going to help attract a bit more people to go and visit. We certainly wish Kelly Black and his team real well.
We do, and it's important that we really look after these jewels in our community. There's lots of them, and they've all had a tough time because of the COVID pandemic, and that includes, of course, Craigdarroch Castle. And next week, we're going to be talking to John Hughes from Craigdarroch about how they didn't close their doors, but they let most of their staff go. They barely kept up operation through the pandemic, but they've regrouped. The doors are opening again. People are starting to show up. The American tourists aren't back, but a lot of other people are heading out that way. We're going to hear more about how they have dealt with their portion of the pandemic. And it's a good story, John.
Yeah, it's a great story. We're getting we're really starting to highlight some of the underutilized, underseen, underviewed places in the region. And so hopefully, but next week, yet again, another almost feels like a hidden personality, hidden viewpoints. Another special guest that I'm really excited to talk about. He's a leader of the Haisla First Nation in Kitimat, went into provincial politics. I've chatted with him over the past year and a bit, a couple times. He's now running to become the next leader of the BC Liberal Party.
And we're talking, of course, about Ellis Ross, who's going to be a guest on our show next week. And he's all about First Nations economic development. And that's been something, John, that we've been really trumpeting since we started doing the Rumble Room, is the importance of getting behind our First Nations, whether it's timber, oil, gas. First Nations deserve to have a voice in future development. We want to hear how Ellis Ross feels about the young activists who've been burning churches and toppling down statues, and lots of heavy material to get through. Can't wait. And John, I'm pumped about next week, but I'm equally pumped about the show we've just had.
Yeah.
And I guess it's ready for us to say goodbye and talk a little bit about how people can support this show, like this show, and tell other people about it.
I'm always sad when we have to wrap it up, because literally I could talk here for hours. I sense, however, I'd be alone talking to nobody. So it's time. We have some great guests coming up. I can't wait to talk to Ellis Ross and hear an Indigenous perspective about what is happening in this province between the fires and COVID and Indigenous relations. Man, there's a lot of stuff happening that we can talk about and wade through. And for all of those folks that want to join us, please think, as these things are showing up on your screen, think about linking to our Facebook page, check out our website. Certainly check out our Twitter page, our YouTube page. But interestingly enough, some of our biggest feedback has been on these now sort of bleeding edge video recording sites like TikTok and Instagram. Robin, some of your editorials have gone viral on TikTok. So for those of you that want a bit of a shorter version of what we're talking about, you want to capture the great personality and thoughts of certainly Robin, certainly myself at here and there, think about joining us on TikTok and on Instagram. But until then, even though I could be chatting for many, many more hours after a long break, I remain, thank you, Chris Coleman, the Croatian sensation, John Juris.
And I'm Robin Adair. And rumble on.